Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on the video. I certainly do appreciate it. In this video, we're going to talk about the top 5 mistakes new Linux users make. My name is Joe Collins, and I run a project called Easy Linux. Easy Linux is a community outreach, and the goal is to help people get started using the Linux operating system at home on their own computers. And I've been doing this now for a few years. I have worked with hundreds of people all over the world to get them started with Linux. I have completely lost count. And if you are finding this video just as you are starting your Linux journey, maybe you haven't even downloaded a Linux distribution yet, you've not attempted an install anywhere, you don't know what hardware you need, I'm really glad that you found this video because it will help you to avoid some pretty common pitfalls. If you are somebody who is already a member of the Linux community and you are watching this video just to see what I say, let me warn you right up front that some of what I say here you might not like, because this video is not for somebody who is already a well-versed member of the Linux community. This video is for somebody who is a computer novice, a newbie, somebody who is just starting out. And the opinions I express in this video come from a great deal of experience working with new users who are not computer nerds, they're not programmers, they're not developers, they're just people who want a stable operating system for their computers, and they are very interested in Linux for any number of reasons. So keep that in mind as you watch the video. So without further ado, we're going to get into the top 5. And we're going to start with number 1. The number 1 mistake that people who start out with Linux make is they choose the wrong hardware. Hardware matters. It is very important. And if you are trying to run Linux on a machine that doesn't like running Linux, that is a very unpleasant experience, and it will give you a very bad impression of the Linux operating system. So let's dive into some of the details here about this common mistake. The big mistake that's being made now is that people go out to the big box store and they buy the cheap $350 laptop that comes with Windows 10, and they take it home and they try and load Linux on it, and then they get very upset when it doesn't work. Don't buy a computer made to run Windows and expect Linux to work on it in 2017. Now, years ago, it was, an okay idea to do that, but the hardware for personal computers has evolved a great deal over the last 3 to 5 years. And a lot of the hardware that is being sold today is designed specifically to run whatever operating system it comes with, especially Windows. There is a system called UEFI. There's another system called Secure Boot. And some hardware manufacturers are actually making it very difficult to run these systems off of anything else. So if you're going to buy a new computer, you're going to put the cash down for a brand new machine, get a new computer that is built to run Linux. A lot of companies sell them these days. In the United States, System 76 sells premium hardware that is designed to run Linux, and it'll run any Linux distribution you want it to. Dell also has a Linux division, and they offer a huge line of laptops and desktop computers that come ready to go for Linux. Linux is already installed. You won't have to do anything. These machines usually ship with Ubuntu, and you can, of course, replace that distribution if you want to, or you can just stick with it and learn how to use Ubuntu. But the point is that the hardware already works with Linux. So if you're going to buy a new machine, consider buying one that's designed to run Linux. It'll save you a lot of heartache. If you're buying a used computer, avoid AMD graphics. AMD graphics support is spotty, especially on machines that are 3 or 4, 5, 6 years old. So that is one thing to watch out for. You are much better off getting a machine that has Intel hardware. Intel is extremely well supported. Most of the time the drivers are already pre-installed in the kernel when you install Linux. Or NVIDIA. NVIDIA has great Linux support. Not all printers and Wi-Fi adapters work with Linux, especially older printers. I can't tell you how many people I have heard say, well, I'd use Linux, but my 8-year-old printer doesn't support Linux, so I can't use Linux. That is ridiculous. Printers are cheap. Buy a new printer if you want to run Linux. If you were going to switch from Windows to Mac and spend all the money for a Macintosh and you found out that your old printer didn't work, you wouldn't think twice about buying a new printer. Don't treat Linux any differently. That's just kind of silly. So you also may need to get a USB Wi-Fi card for older laptops. Many older laptops come with Broadcom internal Wi-Fi cards, and not all Broadcom cards are well supported even though the drivers are available. This is another problem that comes up all the time. People tell me everything works on my laptop except for the Wi-Fi. If you run into that situation, you can chase your tail for an awful long time trying to get that to work, and the quickest solution is to buy one of these little tiny USB dongles, put it in the side of the machine, and use that one instead. And there are many out there that work with Linux without any drivers needing to be installed, and you can find them very quickly when you do research on the web. If you are somebody who is going to build a computer, carefully research each component when building that new computer. You need to make sure that it's going to work well with Linux, especially motherboards. Some motherboard manufacturers make motherboards that work right out of the box with Linux, no problem, and others can be more difficult to get going. So make sure you do your research. Linux will run well on older hardware. I work with people all the time who are using machines that are 10 years old to run Linux. But if you are going to try and install Linux on a really old machine, then you don't expect perfection. It's not going to be high performance, and you may run into a situation where some stuff doesn't work exactly the way you want it to. That's just the nature of the beast. So what should you look for if you're going to buy a used machine? Desktops and laptops that are 3 to 5 years old will be well supported. It takes a while for all of the drivers and everything for hardware to get into the Linux kernel. But anything that's, like I said, 3 to 5 years old, it should work right out of the box, barring that you have one of these AMD graphics cards or a Wi-Fi card that isn't well supported. For used computers, I have found that used HP, Dell, and Lenovo computers are usually really good choices. So those are brands that seem to work really well with Linux and don't require a great deal of setup to get going. One of the important things to keep in mind when we're talking about hardware and Linux is that a lot of people get it backwards. They say Linux doesn't support my printer, or Linux doesn't support my Wi-Fi card, or Linux doesn't support some other part of a computer system. It is not the Linux developer's responsibility to try and support every single piece of software in the world, or rather hardware in the world, by writing driver software and so forth. It's the other way around. It is the hardware vendor's choice to support Linux, and some of them don't. And if you want to run Linux and you believe in the principles of free software and open source, then choose hardware from vendors that support Linux. Okay? That's something very, very fundamental to keep in mind. So do your research before you buy any hardware at all. So let's go to number 2 here. Another big mistake that people who come to Linux for the first time make is that they choose the wrong distribution to start out with. Not all Linux distributions are new user friendly. And unfortunately, some Linux distributions claim to be new user friendly, and they are not new user friendly. The 2 distributions that are absolutely, positively, bona fide new user friendly are Linux Mint. That's best for new users who want a complete desktop without much setup. If you can manage to get Linux Mint installed and running and get all your hardware working, Linux Mint is highly polished and it works very well, and it is easy to keep updated, and it is extremely stable. I know that some of you guys out there that are already in the Linux community have very strong feelings about whatever distribution it is that you're using, but we're talking about a distribution for somebody who doesn't know a great deal about it. And the Linux Mint developers do an excellent job of making sure that the user experience is as smooth as it can be. It's not perfect, there's always room for improvement, but it's a great place to start. The other distribution that is really good for new users, and this is people who want to be a little bit more interactive with the setup process. Maybe you are interested in computers and you want to have a real hands-on approach with it, is Ubuntu Mate. Now I know that says M-A-T-E there, and you might be tempted to call it that, but the developers of the Mate desktop, which that Ubuntu flavor uses, call it Mate. And you can have fun in the comments with that if you want to, but that's the way it is, and I call it Mate. Ubuntu Mate is very well designed, and it is a point-and-click affair to set up an Ubuntu Mate installation. And they have wonderful tools that pop right up on the screen as soon as you boot it up for the first time that take you through the process of actually getting your drivers installed, getting everything up to date. It's a wonderful experience. So if you are somebody who really wants to learn about Linux and you want to get real hands-on with it, then Ubuntu Mate is a good choice for you. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of distributions that you hear a lot about, like Ubuntu, Manjaro, OpenSUSE, and Debian, are good for intermediate level users. These are people who already know a little bit about Linux, and they know how to set things up to get what they need to get done out of the computer. They know the software that they're looking for, and they're willing to roll up their sleeves a little bit and work on it. So those distributions, yes, they are relatively easy to install, but they might require a bit of tinkering to get going. And then finally, Arch and Fedora are suited for advanced Linux users. These are people who have very specific needs, and they know exactly what they want to do with their computers. And Arch Linux in particular is very modular. People can add things to it, take it away. It's also absolutely positively the most difficult to get installed and set up if you do it the Arch way. Manjaro is based on Arch Linux. They try and smooth out a lot of those bumps, but when it comes right down to it, once you get it installed, it's like maintaining an Arch installation to run Manjaro. And I say that for people who know what that's all about. Fedora is a distribution that is really aimed at people who are very, very well versed in the ways of Linux, and they need that distribution to run the latest cutting-edge software. Arch and Fedora are bleeding edge, and when you get out there on the bleeding edge, sometimes you'll find that you also get, lots of bugs. You get all the new software, but you get all the new bugs too. So sometimes it's better to be on a more stable distribution like Ubuntu or Linux Mint. That's another debate that goes on and on, but for my money, I always tell people who don't know where to start with Linux Mint, and then as they learn, they may graduate to something else. You don't have to stay there forever. Most other distributions that you hear about or read about somewhere, they are derivatives of the ones that are already listed above. Like, for instance, I've already mentioned that Manjaro is based on Arch. Linux Mint is Ubuntu compatible. It is based on Ubuntu. Linux Mint is these days developed more alongside Ubuntu than actually just being a new desktop that somebody stuck on Ubuntu, but a lot of the distributions that you see listed on DistroWatch, for instance, they are Ubuntu based, or they will be Debian based. They'll be something else, and you need to avoid those distributions. I'm sorry to say that, but it's absolutely true. If you are starting out for the very first time, those distributions can get you into trouble, especially ones that aren't very well documented. And it'll say something like, you'll think, okay, well, it's Ubuntu based, so I can use the stuff that I read about Ubuntu on this distribution. That may or may not be true. So to start out, stick with the big guys. Stick with the big boys. Linux Mint and Ubuntu Mate, great place to start. If you really, really want to challenge yourself, you can start with straight Ubuntu, Manjaro, OpenSUSE, and Debian, or something like that. But yeah, keep it simple and use one of the bigger distributions to start out. Now, this almost should be the number one thing here, but I put it at number 3 because most of the questions that I get asked are about distributions and hardware. But the biggest mistake people make is that they think Linux is a drop-in replacement for Microsoft Windows. And it is absolutely not Windows, and it doesn't have a great deal to do with Windows. Some distributions of Linux, like Linux Mint, they develop desktops like Cinnamon that kind of look and act like Windows a little bit, and that's just to keep it very familiar. But when you start digging around, you find out pretty quick that it doesn't work like Windows at all. Linux is a Unix work-alike. When it was designed to look and act and work like the Unix operating system. And Unix has its roots way, way back, a long time ago. Unix is a system that was originally designed to run big computers that filled whole rooms and would have many hundreds of users connected to it. Windows, on the other hand, comes up from a PC, just a home computer, very small, humble little operating system called DOS. And so they have developed completely differently, and the underpinnings of the systems are totally different. So keep that in mind. You're not just going from one to the next. You're going to have to learn something new here. Linux is not a product. It is not something that is bought and sold like Mac OS X or a Chromebook or an Android phone even, or a PC that's running Windows. These are all products. They're all somewhat proprietary, and they are all something that you go out and buy. And in the case of those who run Windows, they expect a certain level of support from Microsoft, and they tend to get very frustrated when they don't get it, that sort of thing. So keep that in mind. We're not dealing with a product here. Linux is a community of people who work together to create the tools necessary to do computing in a free and open way. And you may say, well, wait a minute, aren't there companies out there who sell Linux? What about Red Hat? They sell Linux. Yes, they do. But they don't sell Linux itself. They sell support for Linux, and there's a difference. Everything that comes with Red Hat is available elsewhere, and you can get it for free. What Red Hat sells is a support contract. When you buy a registered copy of Red Hat and you pay the fees and the lease fees, you are actually buying their support. So if anything goes wrong with a Red Hat Linux installation, then you can pick up the phone and somebody will help you, and they might even send somebody out to fix it. But Linux itself is completely free and totally available for download all the time. That's why we have so many different distributions, so many different desktops. It's not a product. If you took Windows and did the modifications that people do to it that you did with Linux, Microsoft can come after you because you're messing around, you're breaking the agreement, and you're doing all kinds of stuff you're not supposed to do. Whereas in Linux, anything you want to do is fine. So keep that in mind. It's not a product. Linux is actually simpler than Windows, but it does require time to learn how to use it effectively. And a lot of times you have to unlearn what you already know and start over so you can learn how to use Linux. The hardest person to get started on Linux is a Windows power user, somebody who's been using Windows for 20 years and they know the system inside and out. They know how to trick the system to get it to do what they need it to do. And then they come to Linux and they're really confused because Linux is relatively straightforward. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that say it's hard and it's hard to work with. That's not true. If you approach it the right way and you start from the basics and work your way up, then it's actually quite easy to learn how to use Linux. It just takes a little time. It's best to run Linux separately from your Windows system. So if you're somebody who uses Windows now and you want to get off of Windows and you want to go to Linux, the absolute worst thing that you could do is download a Linux distribution, blow out your Windows installation entirely, and then install that, because you're going to get lost, you're going to get frustrated, and you're probably going to end up reinstalling Windows. It is not the best way to go. The best way to learn Linux is to get another machine and like a little laptop or something like that. You can buy a used one and then put Linux on it and then play with it for a while and actually run it on hardware. Running it in virtual machines does not give you the real experience. Running it off a USB stick that you boot up in a live environment and you leave it in a live environment all the time, that's not a great experience either. No, you need a computer that's actually running Linux that you can work on, and then you play with that, and then you get to a place where you know what you're doing before you dump Windows. Okay, make sure that you know everything you need to know. You're very confident rather, when you go to dump Windows. And if you are going to attempt to do a dual boot with your computer, in other words, you can have Linux running alongside Windows on the same machine. Do that with the knowledge that there are risks involved. And dual boots are very tricky for people who do not understand exactly how computers work. And it is unfortunate that most installers, especially for Ubuntu and Linux Mint, offer in a one-click way a way for you to set up a dual boot, because many people have gotten burnt by that really bad. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I know that every time that I say that, there is somebody who says in the comments to the video, I've run dual boot for years and I've never had a problem. That's wonderful for you. Obviously, you understand how to manage a dual boot. People who are not that computer savvy, they're coming to Linux for the first time, they can get screwed up really fast in a dual boot environment. I don't recommend doing dual boots for new users, but if you do it anyway, just make sure that you have your data backed up on a separate hard drive outside of the machine, like on an external drive, a thumb drive, whatever it takes. Anything you want to keep, make sure that it's there, because if that machine ends up crashing because something goes wrong with an update from Microsoft, or you mess something up with the hard drives, you click the wrong thing somewhere and blow out the bootloader, for instance. I just worked with a guy who did that, and neither his Windows nor his Linux Mint installation worked, and he had to reinstall from scratch. Fortunately, he had good backups, so no problem there. So do keep that in mind. Number 4, this is a big problem. A lot of people who come to Linux for the first time sit there and go, okay, well, I need a piece of software to do this or do that, and then they go search on Google. That's not how you really find software in Linux. It's important to understand that Linux software mostly comes from special repositories that are maintained by the distribution. And there's usually an application in Linux Mint or Ubuntu or any other distribution that gives you a nice graphic little tool that you can search through the software, you can look at it by categories, and then you can install software from the repositories. Software that comes from the repositories is known to work well on your system. It does not contain any malware. It does not contain any security risks. Anything that you install from the official repositories is going to be updated along with everything else on the system when you run updates. So if a vulnerability does pop up in a piece of software that's in the repositories, you're going to be able to get the patch to make sure that you're safe. That is the main reason why you want to stick to the repositories whenever you can. Some software is packaged with from private repositories. Okay, some third-party software is available in privately maintained repositories, and it depends on the company that is supplying the software. For instance, Spotify, which is a client for a music player, a streaming music service that you can install on Linux, they have their own repository. Google has the Google Chrome browser. It's available in its own repository. And then in the Ubuntu world, we have these things called PPAs, which are private program archives, and they are maintained by developers that for one reason or another don't have their software in the main repositories yet. That does take a little time for the distribution to check everything out. You can open up a PPA and you can provide the latest and greatest software that you're developing for Ubuntu. But when you're dealing with these things, you need to make sure that it is very well trusted, and that that you're not just attaching every PPA you come across, because there is always the risk with third-party software that there might be something nefarious in there, malware, viruses, that sort of thing. Now, this is very rare and it doesn't happen very often, and the truth of the matter is I've never heard of anybody who got software that had a malware or viruses in it from a PPA, but I do know of people that have downloaded software from fly-by-night developers who put up a PPA, and then they find that the software crashes, it doesn't work, messes up the system, or a lot of times what happens is that that software stops being maintained, and then the PPA is not working and you can't get updates for the software. So make sure that you know exactly what you're doing if you're going to do that. Proprietary software is mostly available in pre-packaged what they call a deb file for Debian, Ubuntu type Linux, or RPM. And the RPM files are used in Fedora, Red Hat, OpenSUSE, and many others. And for instance, if you go to download Google Chrome and you want to put that on your system, that is considered proprietary software. You will download a deb file, and then you will click on it to install it, and hopefully some tool will pop up that will install that for you. And that works kind of sort of like the exe and installer files that you find for Windows. And in the case of Google Chrome, it will also hook up a repository to your machine that makes sure that you get the updates. TeamViewer is another program like that. There's an audio editor I use called Ocean Audio, which is available as a deb file for download. And when you're doing that, you need to make sure that you are downloading the proper deb file for whatever distribution you are running, and that's down to the version. Make sure that you get the right one. One thing that you should never attempt to do is download and compile software that is distributed as source code and made available in what is known as a tarball. This would be a .tar or .tar.gz file. What this is, it's just software that is in the raw form, and it has not been packaged for your particular version of Linux. And unfortunately, many developers out there say we have Linux support, especially big companies do this, and they say, oh yeah, you can run our software on Microsoft, you can run it on Apple, and you can run it on Linux, and then come to find out they don't have any packages available. It comes down as source code, and then you as the end user have to compile that software, turn it into executable software that your computer can actually use, and then also you're going to have to chase down any dependencies that software might need. So in the Unix Linux world, you may download a piece of software, but it may depend on 3 other programs, and if they're not installed, then it doesn't work. Downloading and installing source code on your computer is also a really good way to directly install malware on the system. And unfortunately, there is nefarious software that is available for download on the internet for Linux that will give you a direct link to malware. And because this software is not part of the repositories, it does not come from a trusted source, it will not get updates even if it works properly. The other thing about it is if you don't know exactly what you're doing, and you attempt to compile a piece of software that wasn't meant for your distribution, let's say that the piece of software you're compiling comes down and it says it's available for Ubuntu 9.10, and you tried to run this on the latest version of Ubuntu or Linux Mint, guess what might happen? It may bork up your system. It won't work because it's not doing that. And 9 times out of 10, when developers have instructions on how to compile, they're wrong and they don't work. This is something I absolutely positively am warning you to stay away from as a new Linux user, because compiling a piece of software and doing it the wrong way can trash your system, especially when talking about drivers. If you are going to attempt to download source code for video drivers or something like that, you run the risk of really messing up your computer where it won't work to the point where you'll have to reinstall. There's usually a better solution out there. Look for it. And finally, don't count on finding exact replacements for Windows or OS X applications. And this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they come to Linux. They say, oh, well, I need to be running this, stupid application version 2.0. This is the one that I use and I can't use anything else. And then they find out it doesn't work on Linux, and then they go, well, I can't use Linux. That's ridiculous. Linux has a huge amount of software available to it, and most of it is for free or already in the repositories. So the best way to find out what software to use is to think about what you're trying to accomplish, and then go searching and do some research on the web to find out what's the best piece of software to do what I want it to do. And sometimes you might find that if you are currently using a piece of software in Windows, to get the job done, you may have to get two pieces of software and do it in two steps to come up with whatever you need. So do your research on that. Now, if you get to a point where you absolutely positively need to have Windows, that's okay. There's a lot of people out there who have just software that they can't find replacements for, or they're, don't have time to learn it just yet. That's fine. Keep your Windows system around and start using Linux for everything else. Linux is definitely a more secure and safer environment to work in than Windows for a lot of different reasons, and if that's the way you feel, then just keep that Windows machine around to use that software. If you're a gamer and you can't get the games that you're looking for on Linux, although gaming on Linux is getting better all the time, keep your Windows machine around and use it just to play a game. That's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But don't be thinking to yourself, well, if I can't get this exact thing to work on Linux, then I won't use it. Expand your mind a little bit. There's nothing wrong with keeping a couple of computers around for a while if you have to. And over time, you may find that you do find the software that you need, and you get more used to how Linux does things. And then after a while, Windows goes poof. I started using Linux 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. But, I kept a Windows machine running for a long time for the same reason. It's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that I have gone 100% Linux. So there's no time limit here. Use the tools that you need to use, and just be thinking that as time goes on that Linux will get better and you'll get better at using it. So there you go. And that kind of dovetails into the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video. Is another huge mistake that people make is they don't take the time to learn. Linux can be very frustrating if you approach it too quickly. If you try and do everything that you need to do with it and try and modify it and change it and do all this stuff right up front, then you are really in for a frustrating time. Take your time. Take it one step at a time. If you're replacing applications, do it one job at a time. Learn everything that you need to know. That's another reason why I always tell people, start out with Linux Mint, start out with Ubuntu Mate. They're extremely stable operating systems. They're not going to change a whole lot over time. And so therefore it will give you time to get used to it and learn it. So give yourself that time. This is, once again, why you shouldn't just switch from one to the other, because then you're going to get really frustrated, especially if you have things that you absolutely need to do. Make sure that you give yourself the time to learn. And read the documentation that comes with your system. Read everything that you can get your hands on online. Take the time to do the research before you actually start messing with things. And if you get confused and you don't quite know what's going on, then just keep looking. Make sure that when you look for information that you include your distribution name and the version. So that's very important, and especially with Ubuntu. Ubuntu has a lot of documentation online, not only from the Ubuntu project itself, but a lot of people have Ubuntu information available that is searchable. Make sure that when you are doing something that it's for your current version. If you are running Ubuntu 16.04, what you read for Ubuntu 14.04 might not apply. And there's a lot of old information out there, so you'll sit there and you'll be looking for the answer to something, and you'll go reading down and go, wow, okay, this is going to work. And then you look down and see that, oh, this is for Ubuntu 8.10. Well, that's 9 years ago. It doesn't apply to Ubuntu today. Ubuntu, like all other Linux distributions, evolves and changes a great deal over time. So make sure that you're getting current information about the exact distribution that you're using. And one of the big mistakes that people make is with Linux Mint a lot of the time. They will say, oh, well, Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, so everything that I read on the Ubuntu wiki, that's going to apply to Linux Mint. Not necessarily the case. So, check out the documentation and the forums and the wikis that are available for your Linux distribution first. And that's big part of that is, doing the research that we just talked about. Make sure that you do the research before you actually ask for help. Make sure that you yourself have taken the time to get as familiar with the issue as possible. You may not have the answer, but make sure that you know what you're talking about before you jump into a forum or a chat room somewhere or reach out to somebody like me out here in the community. Because we know when people have done their research and when they haven't. And you're going to probably find that people will be a lot more responsive to your needs if you are knowing what you're talking about beforehand, because this all goes together. It's like, okay, one of the things that people do is they don't do the research. They get very frustrated. They reach out to somebody in the community, and then they start cussing about how Linux doesn't work and this sucks and they can't get this to work. And that's very offensive to people who are out here in the community. It goes back to Linux not being a product. So if you want to get good support from people in the community and you want to be a good member, make sure that you're always kind, courteous, and make sure that you give detailed information when you ask for help. So if you're having a problem with your graphics, for instance, make sure that you say what distribution of Linux you're running and what graphics hardware is in the computer and what the problem is. And then make sure that that's all in there. You don't have to write paragraphs and paragraphs and big long explanations, but do make sure that you have the pertinent information. What's the problem? What piece of software it is? What the distribution is? And what hardware are you running it on? It helps a lot. So many people will fire off a thing and they'll say, I get these all the time. People fire off a thing and it says, my graphics don't work. Help. I mean, I literally get messages like that. I don't know what graphics you're talking about. What computer is it? How does it make it work? They don't tell me enough information. And sometimes I will stop and take the time to try and pull that information out of them. I'll say, okay, tell me this, this, and this, and I'll go from there. And then other times, especially if it's a really busy day, I may let you go. I may just send you a note that says, I'm not really sure what's going on with that. Not that I'm trying to be nasty or anything, but you need to do your research and you need to make sure that you're asking for help and giving people what they need to be able to help you. So yeah, it's just, be a good person when you do that. And make sure that you're, I guess the best way to talk about the whole frustration thing is, yes, it can be very frustrating. And those of us who are in the community and have been for a long time understand your frustration. We've all been there. But you have to keep in mind that Linux is not a product. It's not a community. It's pretty normal for people to say Windows sucks or Mac sucks or whatever it is. But that's a product. When you say Linux sucks, you're saying a community sucks, and some people take it very personally. So keep that in mind. And finally here, don't be afraid to bork your system. You're going to hear that term. When you bork something up, that means that you yourself do something to trash your computer. And if a system is borked, it means that it doesn't work. The only thing that you can do is format and reload and start over. You're going to do this when you start out with Linux. There are very few Linux users that I know, except for the ones that install a Linux Mint installation and then they only use the email and the browser in it, and they don't really ever mess around with it. Anybody who has any sort of curiosity and they want to dig a little deeper into the system, you might do something to trash your computer. And if that happens, you got to laugh it off, and you got to make sure that you might have to reinstall from scratch. It's just the way this system works. And Linux is funny. It can be extremely stable, or it can be very, very tricky to work with, and it all depends on the user. For instance, like my mom has run Linux for a couple years now, and she never has a problem with it. She never calls me with trouble. Everything just seems to work for her. That's because she doesn't go digging around in the system. But those who start poking at things that they don't quite understand can very easily run a command or click on something and find out, oops, I messed it up. The same is true with Windows, and the same is true with Mac, I guess. But in Linux, it seems to be just sort of a rite of passage that when you first start out and you start messing with it, and you get all cocky and you think, I've got this all together, you bork up your system. It does happen. And that's part of the experimental nature of Linux. So that's why the last thing I said here is have fun. This is not a product that is like, here, this is what we want you to do and this is how we want you to do it. Linux has a lot of options. You can customize it. You can make it do whatever you want it to do. Have fun with it. Don't be afraid of it. Actually, if you break it, you break it. No big deal. Just make sure that you have good backups of all of the important data that you want to keep. And then if you mess up your machine and you have to reload it, hey, you're going to do a better job the second time around. It's usually the way it works. So have fun with it. Don't take it too seriously and take your time. And there you go. So anyway, thank you very much for watching the video. I certainly do appreciate it. I hope it helps. Your feedback is always welcome. Please be sure to give Easy Linux a like on Facebook. We just crossed 3,000 likes not too long ago. That's totally awesome. So if you're not one of those people that absolutely hates Facebook, you can like the page there. Also, please check out EasyLinux.com on the web and check out FreedomPenguin.com for lots of great stories about Linux, and a lot of stuff like this, very practical how-tos come up on FreedomPenguin.com. Some of them from me, some of them from other contributors in the community, and it is a fun website to look at. So thank you for watching once again. We will do it again soon.